Jerry Bunner.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I want to thank you all for coming out this morning, and thank Sue for having me again this year. And I'm going to discuss Lyme disease and biowarfare. Okay, what I'm about to say, most of it is on the internet. If you Google Winston Smith speaks and Lyme disease, it'll come up. The actual web address is pretty long, so just Google Winston Smith speaks, and you'll be able, and my name, you'll be able to find it. Okay, so last year, 2011, I presented a talk on the subversion of modern medicine through the proliferation of treatment guidelines. So an alternate title for this presentation could be Institutionalization of Biowarfare through Treatment Guidelines, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Again, this is a topic I've been writing about for a couple of years. This was in the September edition of the Public Health Alert. A lot of what I'm going to say today, did anybody happen to get that? It's a really good magazine. This whole issue was dedicated to this topic, so I'm trying to cover a lot of material this morning. I'm going to be moving pretty fast. Okay, in this magazine article I said, through the increasing reliance on treatment guidelines, the medical system can be used to wage biological warfare against entire populations through treatment denial. It is not far-fetched to call this the institutionalization of biological warfare. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Again, this is all summarized, basically the biowarfare aspect in one page at the end of this article on the internet. Again, it's on Google website under Winston Smith Speaks. Okay, quickly, my personal background, I'm an industrial physicist. I've been in the microelectronics and micro-optics industry for over 25 years. I've also authored 3 books on unethical medical experimentation. And I'm also a tick-borne disease victim. I was bitten in North Carolina about 6 years ago. I'm recovered under long-term antibiotics administration by a world-class doctor in North Carolina who was effectively put out of business by the North Carolina medical boards because he was treating outside the official treatment guidelines. And as I'm going to show, this long-term treatment is under full-scale assault by profit-oriented interests who have basically ghostwritten fraudulent treatment guidelines through nonprofit organizations such as the IUSA. And I call this the third-party influence peddling strategy, which is designed to create the appearance of a scientific consensus when it's actually just a handful of so-called scientists drafting documents to benefit them and their benefactors. So this is all carried out through what I call the national security infrastructure. And the reason they do that is because they're not held accountable for any level of human experimentation that they conduct. This is the Wikipedia article on unethical human experimentation, and you can see this several times. But in this article, at the end of it, they go through an amazing list of experiments that have been conducted on the public for the last 100 years or so. And they say, as of 2007, not a single U.S. government researcher had been prosecuted for human experimentation. So basically, they can do whatever they want. They're not going to be held accountable, except for public opinion. And that's what we're here to try to help people understand what's really going on. Okay, so this is an AOL News article several years ago about what's going on with Lyme disease. It's a health epidemic that's going largely unnoticed. According to this article, we're in the midst of a terrifying epidemic, and it's actually growing at a rate faster than AIDS. They say that if any other disease had been growing at this rate, doctors would be scrambling for cures to rushing to warn patients. They say that's not the case with Lyme disease. And I'm going to tell you why. Okay, so in Connecticut, which is ground zero for Lyme disease, we have a health disaster. Only 2% of the physicians in Connecticut are actually treating Lyme disease. And everybody knows that Lyme started in Lyme, Connecticut. And patients are desperate for care and they're not getting it. So I say Lyme is a contrived epidemic which is spiraling out of control. It's moving rapidly down the East Coast. It's actually all over the country, but it's just now getting to the point where states like Virginia have called emergency meetings of their legislature to try and address the problem. It's also big in North Carolina. It's all the way down to Florida. And people are starting to wake up as to the magnitude of the problem. So the reason people aren't getting treated is because a climate of fear and ignorance has been deliberately created within the medical community by the so-called experts. This keeps Lyme patients from being diagnosed and treated. So hundreds of thousands of patients each year are being allowed to contract a physically disabling and mentally incapacitating disease. And the actual complexity and devastating nature of the disease is largely hidden from them, and in some cases their doctors. And the contagious nature of the disease is also hidden from them, allowing the disease to spread. So this talk will address why and how this is being done. Basically, if you control the definition of a disease, you control how it is treated or how it's not treated, and you can make a lot of money. It's all about the money. So I mentioned that I had been bitten in North Carolina. This is an article from the Raleigh News Observer. This is 2009. The title of the article is State Affirms Lyme Disease Danger. So this is a story that's repeated all over the country and all over the world. A mother with a desperately sick child, or perhaps she's desperately sick herself, is trying to get diagnosed and treated for Lyme disease. So this woman was in Asheville, North Carolina, and she took her son to several doctors, couldn't get diagnosed. Typical story. The article says that more than one doctor told her Lyme disease was not a fact in North Carolina. This is the mantra that they repeat, that Lyme does not exist in this state. In the States, even when the Lyme test came back positive, the doctors still questioned the diagnosis. So this is a public health disaster, as I mentioned. Why is this going on? So the article went on to say, after years of cautioning that people were unlikely to get Lyme disease in North Carolina, the state health leaders are now advising that the tick-borne illness can in fact be acquired here. So thank you very much. So why did they deny the obvious for so long, causing needless suffering for patients like me and others, and doctors like mine, who was basically put out of business? I mentioned that Virginia is informing their public of the epidemic that's raging in their state of Lyme disease. This is in the Roanoke Times just last year. Really good, large article in that paper. They stated that upwards of 30 doctors have been sanctioned in the past decade that are trying to treat Lyme disease. And a lot of physicians in the state are hesitant to even get involved because of the medical debate that's raging about the disease. So the medical debate is actually a handful of manufactured experts creating a simple-minded and profit-friendly disease model. They want to limit the means of transmission, which helps restrict the treatment of the disease. So they don't want to admit that certain ticks can spread Lyme disease or other insects. They want to narrow the definition of the symptoms and treatments. And this is the hard-to-catch, easy-to-cure model of Lyme disease. So they also use the government to destroy doctors who successfully treat the disease, like my doctor, so that they and their wealthy benefactors can make money studying the disease and treating the symptoms. Okay, this is my favorite quote by Dr. Ed Masters. He's describing how the establishment experts have been wrong on Lyme disease from day one. He said, first off, they said it was a new disease, which it wasn't. Then it was thought to be viral, which it isn't. Then it was thought to be seronegative, and it isn't, which means it doesn't necessarily show up in the blood test. Then they thought it was easily treated by short courses of antibiotics, which it sometimes isn't. Then it was the exotic tick, which we now know is not even a separate valid tick species. So if you look at the history of the disease, almost every time a major dogmatic statement has been made, it was subsequently proved wrong or underwent major modifications. So the experts are always wrong in the same direction. It's always in favor of the treatment denial, rationale, again, restricting the transmission modes and the disease vectors, at least the ones that they'll admit to transmit the disease, restricting the disease definition and its geographical distribution, and restricting the test interpretation. They're biased in favor of saying it's false positives instead of false negatives, and it ends up restricting treatment. So here's another example. You go to the CDC website, which I just did yesterday, and they say that the ticks not known to transmit Lyme disease include the American dog tick and the brown dog tick. Well, just last week, this article came out of the BBC, which, again, the experts were wrong. Lyme disease risk from dogs is higher than thought. Now, this is in Britain. Say that ticks can transmit Lyme disease and may be more prevalent in the UK than realized. And they say now, after doing random checks, experts suspect the problem is even bigger than they thought. So again, the experts are wrong. So this is obviously not a trivial thing, because if untreated, Lyme disease can spread to the brain, heart, joints, and in extreme cases can cause nerve damage, paralysis, and blindness. So this is to put a human face on this. Again, this is an article from Britain. This is another mother trying to get her son treated for Lyme disease. This poor woman had to finally get her son treated by a veterinarian. The mother was quoted as saying, "You expect to be in the best hands at the hospital, but they didn't seem to know what to do. The nurse at the vet's was fantastic." And the father added, "Daniel got better service there than at the hospital." So this is actually not an isolated case. People are so desperate that they're resorting to getting treated by veterinarians. So if your kid can't get a doctor to diagnose and treat him, and if you can't find a veterinarian to treat him, and if you're crazy enough to keep insisting that your children are sick or that you're sick and need treatment other than just treating the symptoms, the problem is not the medical system, according to the experts. The problem is you. I'll show you why. This is an article by Virginia Scher. Others all over the world actually are being accused of having Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which so-called experts blame the mother for trying to treat their children. They're saying that the mother is making the children sick. This is from the article. It says thousands of children sick with complex diseases have been forcibly removed from their mothers, who insist that their children are ill. The mothers are vilified, frequently jailed, and publicly shamed. I'm sure some of you know mothers that have been through this. I know several. And in actuality, many such cases involve unrecognized Lyme borreliosis. This is a statement, kind of summarizes this whole situation by a Lyme activist that asked me to keep her name anonymous because she's afraid of reprisals. She said, "Never would I have deemed it possible that a group of medical people would work so vigorously and with such malice against a group of desperately ill people." But here it is. Ain't that the truth? Okay, so here we are back to the News Observer article. So why did the so-called health leaders deny the obvious for so long? And where do these health leaders come from? And do they have an agenda? Well, a lot of them come from something called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is a secretive branch of the CDC. How many people here have heard of the EIS? Just a few of you? Okay. This is an article from the American Journal of Epidemiology. So, the article says, in the year 2000, 43% of state and territorial epidemiologists were EIS graduates. So it's typically the state epidemiologists that are the ones denying that Lyme disease exists in their state, and if it doesn't exist there, then you're not going to get treated for it, more than likely. So this is just to show you how powerful the EIS is, and the fact that very few people here have ever heard of it speaks to the fact that they can work in the background. So it says the current CDC director, the deputy director, 9 of the 11 organizational units are directed by EIS graduates, and much of the CDC leadership throughout the organization. It also includes 2 Surgeon Generals of the United States. Also have leaders in the World Health Organization and the World Bank and other international organizations and foundations. So this is an extremely powerful and secretive group. We have very highly graduates in the medical infrastructure. This is another article in the APA magazine on the disease trail, again the EIS. It was actually developed or formed as an early warning system against biological warfare and man-made epidemics. And again, many of the nation's health leaders are graduates of this program. This is a Wikipedia article just describing the EIS. Again, it was formed during the Korean War era as a response to biological warfare concerns. And again, even the CDC itself was founded during World War II as a quasi-military organization. So we have what I call the military-industrial medical complex. The actual civilian health infrastructure is to a large extent run in the background by the military, which has major ramifications. Okay, so do they have an agenda? I propose that the agenda is they're running a Tuskegee Experiment in treatment denial, and this is actually phase 2 of the program. They're using a similar but more sophisticated spirochete pathogen. The syphilis spirochete was used in the Tuskegee Experiment phase 1. The Lyme spirochete is actually a more advanced version of this. I'll show you why later on if I have time. They're also using a similar but more sophisticated methodology for denying treatment. I'll go into great detail on that. Basically, they're using treatment guidelines and the secrecy of the national security system to do this. Just a quick overview of the Tuskegee Experiment. Ran for over 40 years. Human guinea pigs were used. They were not given proper treatment, and many died of syphilis and its side effects, and it spread to their families. The study was conducted to determine from autopsies what the disease does to the human body. So they wanted the disease to progress untreated so that they could monitor the systematic destruction that it caused, because they wanted to develop countermeasures. So this was actually published in the medical literature for decades. Nobody bothered to look at it. It was fairly routine. So this, read through the articles. This is one article I found. They were making comments like, so far we are keeping the known positive patients from getting treatment. They were very pleased with themselves. They were able to carry out this experiment, like I said, for decades, and actually publish the results. It was until the 1970s that a journalist actually started to make a lot of noise, and they had to shut down the experiment. So just this last year, there's been major revelations about the extent of the Tuskegee experiment. Everybody thought it was just an isolated experiment in Tuskegee, Alabama, that they were denying treatment for syphilis of a localized community. They kept the victims from seeing doctors because they were geographically isolated. But it actually was an international experiment, and it involved deliberate exposure to syphilis. This has actually been going on for over 100 years. People have been injected with syphilis. It's all part of vaccination studies, which I'll get into later on. In this case, the most recent episode was actually run by the U.S. government. This is a Latin phrase which translates who watches the watchman or who polices the police. So we've got these people that are running the health infrastructure, but who's minding the store? Who keeps them in line? Well, actually, no one does. They can pretty much do what they want, except for public opinion. So if you wanted to conduct a modern Tuskegee experiment under the guise of biological warfare, how would you do it today? Well, I would infiltrate the EIS Biowarfare Response Agency. They're responsible for alerting the public that a biowarfare pathogen is running rampant. And then orchestrate a controlled stand down, which means you don't do anything about it. And then you can experiment at will using various biological warfare pathogens. Preferably, if you use ones that appear to be naturally occurring, it would be fairly easy to run the experiment. You can just say it's naturally vectored disease, and it wasn't deliberately concocted or allowed to run rampant. So this might involve deliberate exposure to the pathogen, denial of treatment, and then experimentation with various countermeasures. Again, they can do this because they don't ever get caught and never held accountable. Okay, so this is an excellent article by Elena Cook. Has anyone here ever actually read this? This is, if you just Google Elena Cook, Lyme, Biowarfare, you come up with this article. It's a really fantastic summary. And her conclusion is, it's possible to see the modern history of Lyme as a string of events with an EIS member at every crucial node. And the EIS, again, is the Epidemic Intelligence Service. So they have their agents stationed at every node of the disease, and that's why we have such a public health disaster. So I'm just going to give you a real brief overview of the last 60 years in human experimentation. If what I'm saying sounds kind of wild, this is actually fairly routine. So this is a history that we actually know about. Many of the experiments that were conducted, they destroyed the records. We just have some outlines of what the projects involved. So real quickly, this was New York Times in the 1990s. When the radiation experiments came to light, there was over 3 decades of radiation experiments on humans. You can go online and you can page through thousands and thousands of lists of experiments through the DOE. They also ran experiments where whole populations were irradiated. This is the Green Run experiment, where the plutonium processing plant, they allowed the radiation to spread over populated areas. The infamous MK Ultra testing. And this came out in the 1970s. They were testing drugs on individuals at all social levels, high and low, Native American and foreign. Testing has been performed on a variety of individuals within these categories. Again, they destroyed the record, so we don't know the full extent of this testing. We just have a list of the various projects. This is just an overview. This is a congressional investigation that describes the scope of the study. There's 185 non-government researchers involved, and this was all done through mostly the civilian infrastructure. This was not necessarily government agents running these projects. Involved 149 sub-projects, 80 institutions, 44 colleges, 15 research foundations, various hospitals, and penal institutions. And this is just a list from Wikipedia, if you want to go on there and just see a list of all the things they experimented with: drugs, chemicals, psychological warfare, etc. So this testing continues to make news headlines even in 2009. This is an article again from the Raleigh News Observer. They tested a lot of drugs on the veterans, and they're still testing drugs on the veterans. This is an article just within the last 3 years. We're still...
Veterans?
Pardon?
They did that on war veterans?
Yeah.
While they were at war, or what they did?
Yeah, this is, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to create soldiers that will kill and not feel guilty about it. So they're trying to medicate them so that they won't have the guilt typically associated with going over to some country and having to kill people, in some cases kids. And if they do, they want to medicate them so that they can try to forget what they've done. This has been going on for decades, like I said, and it's still going on. So they also tested biological warfare agents as part of the MKUltra. And part of this research, I wrote a book on this, on so-called transplantability of human cancer. This was done throughout the 50s and 60s. Doctors were actually injecting human subjects with cancer. This is an article I found which explains how they were doing it. They would take cancer cells from a cancer patient, process them, and inject them in a healthy donor. They would inject them and mark the location with a dye so that they could measure the tumors that resulted. And again, this was all published in the open medical literature, went on for decades. And this particular set of experiments is also published on the internet. It's on a website called WinstonSmith.net. There's an article about Chester Southwick, who was the doctor that ran most of these experiments. Okay, so I'm just trying to give you a feel for the fact that large-scale experimentation is the norm. It's not the exception. And I believe a massive biological crime is still being committed. It's by this secretive, powerful group within the CDC, the EIS. The membership list is actually a secret. I had a lawyer, I had a FOIA request to try to get the actual membership list, which they refused to give me. It involves institutional control of the medical health infrastructure by a combination of corporate, government, and academia personnel, but it's all run by the corporate aspect at the top. And I call this Tuskegee through treatment guidelines because it's still going on today at the use of treatment guidelines. Phase 1 was done through the U.S. Public Health Service in conjunction with the AMA, and I'm claiming that Phase 2 is being done through the CDC and the EIS organization within it, and the IDSA, which is the medical group that drew up the infamous Lyme treatment guidelines. And again, I call this institutionalized biowarfare through treatment guidelines. It involves treatment denial for Lyme disease. So again, just a quick update on the Tuskegee experiment. This was in the Lancet. This is just December, a little bit over a year ago. I say it read like a bad horror story. If this were fiction, the study's investigators would have been archetypal mad scientists. But the study was conducted by no less than the U.S. Public Health Service and the NIH. And this was covered, this made international headlines because a professor named Susan Reverly started writing an article about the actual deliberate infection aspect of the experiment, which took place in Guatemala and back in the U.S. So I like how they described this, that lapses were made. There were lapses by leaders in the syphilis tests. You and I had done it, it would have been a medical crime, but it's ethical lapses when the elite do it. Just to give you an idea of the scale, so-called ethical errors were made by a startling array of public health officials, the Surgeon General, the Attorney General, the President of the AMA, President of the National Academy of Sciences, and experts from the various universities, including Harvard, Johns Hopkins, etc. So, if you have any doubt that such an experiment could be carried out, like I claim is being carried out with Lyme disease, this is a precedent that it can be done at the highest level of the government. So, I say, who says the government can't orchestrate medical crimes at the highest levels, keep secrets for decades? They obviously can. Okay, I wrote another article in the Public Health Alert last summer called The Lyme Disease Epidemic, CDC Tuskegee Experiment Phase 2. And in that article I say that America's most egregious example of medical malpractice through treatment denial is now an everyday reality conducted on a grand scale and run with the complicity of the CDC. And I have referred to this as the institutionalization of the Tuskegee Experiment, which it is. So, how closely are Tuskegee and Lyme related? Well, as I said before, both are caused by spirochetes. They have similar infectious phases, and the Lyme disease infection is actually more complex and deadly than syphilis. This is from Wikipedia, just showing you the relationship of the spirochete, the Borrelia spirochete, which causes Lyme disease. It's actually very closely related to the Treponema spirochete that causes syphilis. You can see here the Borrelia of the relapsing fever family are very similar to the Borrelia